Deep in the heart of southern Africa, hidden beneath centuries of earth and silence, lies a mystery that powerful forces tried to erase from history. Towering stone walls that rival anything built in medieval Europe. A civilization so wealthy that gold flowed from its mines to kingdoms thousands of miles away. A city so magnificent that when Europeans first encountered it, they refused to believe Africans could have built it. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, the lost city of gold. And the truth about what happened here is far more extraordinary and far more disturbing than you've ever been told. It's September 1871. The African sun beats down mercilessly on the rocky plateau of what is now Zimbabwe. A German geologist named Karl Mauch stumbles through the bush, sweat pouring down his face, following the excited gestures of his African guides. They've been telling him stories of ancient ruins, stories of gold, stories of a lost civilization, and then he sees it. Rising from the landscape like something from a fever dream, massive stone walls tower above him. Granite blocks fitted together without mortar, so precisely that a knife blade cannot slip between them. The walls curve and undulate across the hillside, creating passages and enclosures of breathtaking complexity. Some sections rise over 30 feet high. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The scale is monumental. Karl Mauch stands frozen, his mind racing. He's looking at something that shouldn't exist, not here, not in Africa. According to everything he's been taught, everything his European education has told him, Africans are incapable of building something like this. His brain simply cannot process what his eyes are seeing. So he does what many Europeans of his era would do when confronted with evidence that contradicted their racist worldview. He lies. In his journal that night, by flickering candlelight, Mauch writes that these ruins must have been built by Phoenicians. Or perhaps it was the legendary Queen of Sheba. Or maybe, and this becomes his favorite theory, this is actually the biblical land of Ophir, King Solomon's mines, the source of his legendary wealth. Anyone but Africans. It could be anyone but Africans. But Karl Mauch isn't the first outsider to encounter these ruins. Portuguese traders heard rumors of them in the 1500s. Arab merchants spoke of them even earlier. Local African peoples have known about them for generations, preserving oral histories that speak of powerful kings and vast wealth. And the name itself, Zimbabwe, comes from the Shona phrase Zimba Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone or venerated houses. These ruins are not a mystery to the people who live here. They know exactly who built them, but the world is about to spend the next century trying to prove them wrong. The site Mauch has stumbled upon is actually a complex of several distinct areas. There's the hill complex, perched on a steep granite slope, with its maze-like passages and enclosures commanding a view of the valley below. There's the great enclosure in the valley itself, an elliptical structure with walls over 30 feet tall and 16 feet thick at the base, making it the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara. And scattered between them are hundreds of smaller ruins, remnants of what was once a thriving city. But here's what makes Mauch's discovery particularly infuriating. The ruins aren't even abandoned. Local Shona people are living in and around them, farming the land, maintaining their ancestral connection to this place. Yet Mauch treats them as primitive squatters in someone else's ruins, too ignorant to understand the significance of their own heritage. The irony is suffocating. Mauch needs African guides to even find the place. He requires African translators to communicate. He depends on African knowledge to navigate the landscape. And yet he cannot conceive that Africans themselves built these magnificent structures. Word of the ruins spreads across Europe. Adventurers, treasure hunters, and archaeologists begin making the journey. But they don't come to study or preserve. They come to plunder. They're convinced that somewhere in these ruins lies King Solomon's gold. They dig, they blast, they tear apart walls looking for hidden chambers. They carry away artifacts by the cartload, golden beads, soapstone sculptures, iron tools, ceramic pottery, shipping them back to European museums where they're displayed as curiosities from an unknown civilization. The destruction is catastrophic. Cecil Rhodes, yes, that's Cecil Rhodes, The British mining magnate and colonizer, whose name would eventually be given to Rhodesia, sends his agents to excavate the site. They're not archaeologists. They're looters with official backing. They dig through layers of history like gravediggers, destroying priceless, contextual information in their hunt for gold and treasure. What they don't steal, they often destroy. But even as they're looting these ruins, even as they're literally digging through the evidence, they maintain their denial. The artifacts they're finding, the intricate goldwork, the carved soapstone birds, the sophisticated metalworking, all of it points to an advanced African civilization. But the cognitive dissonance is too great. The racism is too deeply embedded. One treasure hunter, a man named J. Theodore Bent, arrives in 1891. He's determined to prove the ruins are Phoenician. He measures everything. He draws maps. He excavates test trenches. And everywhere he looks, he finds evidence of African origin. The pottery matches Shona styles. The metallurgy is consistent with regional traditions. Even the architectural techniques are distinctly Southern African. But Bent cannot accept this. In his published report, he writes, "The ruins are in every way identical with the Zimbabwe ruins and cannot be dated later than the Middle Ages of Europe." He's so close to the truth, so heartbreakingly close. But he still attributes them to northern races who came south. Here's what these early excavators are finding, though they refuse to acknowledge its significance. Beads from India and Persia, Chinese ceramics, Arab coins, glass from the Middle East. This isn't just evidence of African construction. It's evidence of African trade networks spanning thousands of miles. It's proof that this civilization was plugged into the global economy of its time, trading with Asia, the Middle East, and the East African coast. But what they discovered next would make it even harder to deny the truth. Enter David Randall McIver, a young archaeologist who arrives at Great Zimbabwe in 1905 with something his predecessors lacked: intellectual honesty. He's been trained in the emerging scientific methods of archaeology. He understands stratigraphy, the layering of historical deposits. He knows how to properly date artifacts based on their context and style, and what he discovers enrages the colonial establishment. After careful excavation and analysis, Randall McIver publishes his findings. Great Zimbabwe is medieval, not ancient. The artifacts are African, not foreign. The construction techniques are indigenous, not imported. And most damning of all, the site was built and occupied by the ancestors of the Shona people who still live in the region. In other words, Africans built this. Africans created this magnificent civilization. And it happened not in some distant, mythical past, but in the same era when Europeans were building their Gothic cathedrals. The backlash is immediate and vicious. Randall McIver is attacked in academic journals. His methodology is questioned. His character is impugned. The Rhodesian government, the colonial administration that now controls this territory, is particularly hostile. They have a vested interest in maintaining the lie. If Africans built this, if Africans were capable of this level of civilization, then the entire moral justification for colonialism collapses. Think about what's at stake here. The British South Africa Company, Cecil Rhodes' colonial enterprise, has claimed this land. They've dispossessed the Shona and Ndebele peoples, taken their territory, forced them into labor. And they've justified all of this with the racist ideology that Africans are primitive, incapable of self-governance, in need of European civilization. Great Zimbabwe is a massive granite monument to the lie at the heart of colonialism. So the colonial government does what governments always do when confronted with inconvenient truths. They attack the messenger, suppress the message, and double down on the propaganda. But science is relentless. Truth has a way of seeping through the cracks of even the most robust denial. In 1929, another archaeologist arrives. Her name is Gertrude Caton Thompson, and she's about to deliver a knockout blow to the racist theories. Caton Thompson is methodical. She excavates with precision. She documents everything. She uses the latest dating techniques. And when she presents her findings at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1931, she leaves no room for doubt. Great Zimbabwe is an African achievement. she declares. The pottery is Shona, the beads are medieval. The construction date is somewhere between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. There is no evidence of any non-African presence before the Portuguese in the 16th century. The silence in that academic hall must have been deafening. Here was a respected British archaeologist, using impeccable scientific methodology, confirming what African oral traditions had said all along. Africans built this. But even this doesn't end the debate. The colonial government of Rhodesia effectively bans further archaeological research that might support African origin. They control access to the site. They control what can be published. And in schools across Rhodesia, children, both black and white, are taught that Great Zimbabwe was built by foreigners. The lie is institutionalized. It becomes part of the national mythology. This is the insidious thing about historical erasure. It's not just about denying the past, it's about controlling the present. If you can convince people that Africans never built anything of significance, then you can justify taking everything from them. If you can make them believe they have no history of achievement, no legacy of greatness, then you can more easily subjugate them. And it works. For decades, it works. Even many educated people around the world believe that Great Zimbabwe is some kind of anomaly, possibly built by outsiders. The truth is suppressed, minimized, questioned at every turn. But let's step back from this depressing chronicle of academic racism and colonial propaganda. Let's ask the question that should have been asked from the beginning. Who actually built Great Zimbabwe, and why? To answer that, we need to go back, way back, before the ruins, before the gold trade, before the stones were ever stacked. We need to understand the world that gave birth to this civilization. The story begins not with a single moment, but with centuries of development. The broader region of southern Africa has been inhabited for thousands of years. Hunter-gatherer communities roamed these lands. Then came the Bantu migrations, waves of agricultural peoples spreading southward across the continent, bringing with them iron-working technology, new crops, and new ways of organizing society. By the first millennium CE, the Gokomer people, ancestors of the Shona, are settling in the Zimbabwe plateau. They're farmers and cattle herders. They work iron and gold. They build stone enclosures for their cattle. Zimbabwe. These early structures are modest, but they establish a tradition. Stone walls aren't just functional. They're prestigious. They're markers of status and power. The land itself is generous. The granite hills provide building material. The plateau has good soil for agriculture. The region is blessed with gold. Lots of gold. And where there's gold, there's trade. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a trade network is emerging along the East African coast. Arab and Persian merchants establish trading posts. They want gold, they want ivory, they want iron. And the interior of southern Africa has all three. The Swahili coast becomes a conduit between Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world. Ships sail from the coast to Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China. African goods flow east, Eastern goods flow west. But here's the crucial point. This isn't exploitation. This isn't colonialism. This is trade between equals. The African kingdoms control the interior. They control the sources of gold and ivory. They set the terms. The coastal merchants need them more than they need the merchants. And as this trade expands, wealth begins accumulating in the interior. Villages grow into towns. Towns grow into centers of power. And sometime around the 11th century, in the heart of the Zimbabwe plateau, something extraordinary begins to emerge. A city starts to rise. A city built of stone, a city that will eventually cover over 1,700 acres and house perhaps 18,000 people at its peak. A city that will become the capital of an empire. But the real question isn't just how it was built. The real question is, who ruled it? What kind of society created this? And what happened when their civilization reached its zenith? The answer to that question is about to reshape everything we thought we knew about medieval Africa. Imagine standing at the base of the hill complex around the year 1300 CE. The morning sun is just cresting the horizon, and the granite walls above you glow gold in the early light. The air is alive with sound, the lowing of cattle in the enclosures below, the ring of hammers on metal from the blacksmith's quarter, the chatter of traders speaking a dozen different languages. Smoke rises from cooking fires. The smell of roasting meat and grain porridge drifts on the breeze. You're standing at the heart of one of Africa's greatest civilizations, though you wouldn't use that word. To you, this is simply your world. This is home. Great Zimbabwe at its height is not just a city, it's a political capital, a religious center, a trading hub, and a statement of power carved in stone. The king, the Mambo, rules from the hill complex, the ancient core of the settlement. Up there, behind those imposing walls, resides not just a man, but a sacred institution. The Mambo is more than a political leader. He's a religious figure, a link between the living and the ancestors, between the earthly and the divine. Let's climb those granite steps and peer into the world of power at Great Zimbabwe. The approach is deliberately designed to impress and intimidate. Narrow passages wind between massive boulders and constructed walls. You can't see what's ahead. The path turns and doubles back. It's disorienting, and it's intentional. By the time a visitor reaches the inner enclosures, they've been reminded at every turn that they're entering a sacred space, approaching someone of immense power. The Mambo doesn't rule alone. He's supported by a complex hierarchy of officials, priests, and advisors. There are the Vazongas, sub-chiefs who control outlying territories and collect tribute. There are religious specialists who interpret the will of the ancestors through spirit mediums. There are craftsmen who create the prestige goods that mark royal power, the carved soapstone birds that have become symbols of Zimbabwe, the intricate goldwork, the iron weapons and tools. And then there are the merchants. Oh, the merchants. Because Great Zimbabwe's power isn't built primarily on military conquest. It's built on trade. The city sits at the nexus of trading routes that reach from the goldfields of the interior to the Swahili coast, hundreds of miles to the east. From there, African goods reach the wider world. Let's talk about gold, because that's what everyone focuses on, the gold. And yes, there's gold, lots of it. The Zimbabwe plateau is rich in gold deposits, and people have been mining them for centuries. But here's what makes Great Zimbabwe different: organization and scale. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe don't necessarily control the mines directly. What they control is the trade. They control access to the coast. They control the collection of tribute. They control the redistribution of wealth. And they take a cut of everything that moves through their territory. Gold is panned from rivers and mined from quartz reefs. The miners are skilled specialists. They dig narrow shafts following the gold-bearing veins. They use fire setting to break the rock, heating the stone with intense fires, then dousing it with water to fracture it. It's dangerous work, but the rewards are substantial. The gold is refined, worked into various forms: beads, bracelets, nuggets, and then traded. But gold isn't the only commodity. Ivory is huge. Elephant ivory is prized across the Indian Ocean world. It's carved into decorative objects, ground into powder for traditional medicine, used for ornamental purposes. And southern Africa has elephants, lots of them. Hunters bring tusks to Great Zimbabwe. The rulers take their share. The rest is traded east. There's also copper from the north, iron tools, cloth, grain, cattle, and salt. Great Zimbabwe is a clearinghouse for goods from across the region. Traders from the coast, Swahili merchants, perhaps some Arab traders, arrive with their exotic goods. Glass beads from Persia, ceramics from China, cotton cloth from India, colored glazed pottery from the Islamic world. And here's the fascinating thing. These aren't just luxury goods for the elite. Excavations have found imported beads in commoner houses. This is a society wealthy enough that even ordinary people can afford some level of participation in the trade economy. This is prosperity trickling down, at least to some degree. The great enclosure in the valley below the hill complex tells its own story. This massive elliptical structure, over 800 feet in circumference at its widest point, is likely built during Great Zimbabwe's peak, probably in the 14th century. Its walls are the pinnacle of the architectural tradition. They're perfectly vertical. They're adorned with decorative patterns, chevrons, and other geometric designs near the top. And inside, there's the conical tower, A solid stone structure over 30 feet tall, its purpose still debated. Is it symbolic? Is it religious? Is it a representation of a grain bin, symbolizing prosperity? Some scholars believe the great enclosure was the royal residence, the Mambo's palace. Others think it might have been a place for royal wives and relatives. Still others suggest it was a space for initiation ceremonies or religious rituals. The truth is, we don't know for certain. The oral traditions don't give us complete answers, and the archaeological record, damaged by early looters, doesn't provide all the clues we need. But what we do know is that building these structures required massive organization. Think about the logistics. Every stone had to be quarried from the local granite, shaped to fit, and then carried to the construction site. The walls of the great enclosure contain an estimated 900,000 granite blocks. That's millions of pounds of stone. And it's not just piled up, it's carefully constructed using a sophisticated technique of coursing, where stones are laid in even layers, each slightly receding inward as the wall rises. This requires skilled masons. It requires a workforce. It requires an organizational structure capable of mobilizing labor and resources on a massive scale. It requires an economy that can support people who aren't farming, who are instead building, crafting, trading, administering. In other words, it requires a state, a complex society with specialization of labor, with hierarchy, with institutions that coordinate collective action. And that's exactly what Great Zimbabwe is. A state, not a village, not a chiefdom, a state. Let's walk through the city at its height. Beyond the royal precincts, the city spreads across the landscape. Archaeologists have identified hundreds of smaller enclosures, family homesteads, each surrounded by stone walls. The layout is organic, following the contours of the land. There are no straight streets, no grid pattern, but there's clearly organization. Certain areas are devoted to specific crafts. Over here, you find the metalworking quarter. Slag heaps mark where iron and copper were smelted. Over there, you find evidence of gold working. In another area, pottery kilns. The houses themselves are simple but effective. Circular huts built with wooden poles and packed earth, thatched roofs. The stone walls don't form the houses. They enclose the homestead, marking boundaries, providing prestige, protecting livestock. And cattle. We need to talk about cattle, because in Shona culture, as in many southern African societies, cattle are wealth. They're not primarily food, though they're slaughtered for special occasions. They're capital, they're bride wealth, they're insurance. A man's status is measured in cattle, and Great Zimbabwe has cattle. The bones found in archaeological excavations show that cattle are abundant. The rulers accumulate cattle through tribute. They redistribute them through patronage. The system is built on cattle as much as gold. The religious life of the city is complex. The Shona religious tradition recognizes a supreme creator god, Mori, but most religious practice focuses on ancestors. The ancestors are intermediaries. They can bless or curse the living. They must be appeased, honored, consulted. Spirit mediums, men and women who become possessed by ancestor spirits, play crucial roles in political and religious life. When major decisions need to be made, the Mambo consults the ancestors through these mediums. The carved soapstone birds found at Great Zimbabwe, 8 of them have been discovered, are likely connected to this ancestor veneration. They're extraordinary objects, about 16 inches tall, birds of prey carved in meticulous detail, mounted on tall stone pedestals. They were placed in the eastern enclosure of the hill complex, perhaps representing royal ancestors, perhaps serving as intermediaries between the earthly and spiritual realms. These birds will eventually become national symbols of Zimbabwe. They appear on the modern flag, but their exact original meaning remains somewhat mysterious. Great Zimbabwe's influence extends far beyond its stone walls. This is the capital of an empire. Outlying settlements across the plateau show similar architectural styles, smaller Zimba constructed in imitation of the capital. These are administrative centers, controlling local regions, collecting tribute, maintaining trade routes. The political reach of Great Zimbabwe extends for hundreds of miles. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Great Zimbabwe exists contemporaneously with medieval Europe. While Great Zimbabwe is at its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe is building its Gothic cathedrals. The Crusades are happening. The Mongol Empire is at its peak. The Black Death is sweeping across Eurasia. Marco Polo is traveling to China. This isn't ancient history. This is the medieval world. Great Zimbabwe is participating in the global economy of the medieval Indian Ocean world, just as Venice and Genoa are dominating Mediterranean trade. In fact, let's make some comparisons. The Great Enclosure at Great Zimbabwe is larger than any single medieval European structure before the Great Cathedrals. The total stone construction at Great Zimbabwe dwarfs most European castles of the period. The trade networks reaching Great Zimbabwe are as extensive as anything in medieval Europe, arguably more so since African goods are reaching China, while European goods are not yet reaching Africa's interior. This isn't a competition, but it's important context. Great Zimbabwe represents a level of civilization that rivals anything happening anywhere in the world at that time. And yet, for centuries, the world was told this was impossible, that Africans couldn't achieve this, that it must have been built by someone else. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but here's where our story takes a turn. Because empires don't last forever, cities rise and fall, and Great Zimbabwe, for all its power and prosperity, is heading toward a crisis. The question is, what brought down this mighty civilization? Was it conquest? Was it climate? Was it internal collapse? The answer is complex, tragic, and surprisingly relevant to our modern world. And what researchers discovered about its decline reveals something shocking about the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. Let's place ourselves in Great Zimbabwe around the year 1450. Something is wrong. You can feel it in the air, see it in the faces of the people, hear it in the worried consultations between the Mambo's advisors. The rains haven't come as they should. The grazing lands are overgrazed. The city, once a thriving hub of activity, is beginning to feel strained. The collapse of Great Zimbabwe is one of the great mysteries of African history, and like most historical collapses, there's no single cause. It's a convergence of factors, a perfect storm that brings down a civilization that had dominated the region for centuries. Let's start with the environment. Archaeological and climate data suggest that the 15th century brings significant environmental stress to the Zimbabwe plateau. The climate is changing. The region is becoming drier. And Great Zimbabwe, with its large population and massive herds of cattle, is vulnerable. Remember, this is a city of perhaps 18,000 people at its peak. That's 18,000 mouths to feed. And it's not just people. The ruling elite accumulate cattle as a form of wealth and power. The archaeological evidence suggests that the lands around Great Zimbabwe are heavily grazed. The vegetation is stressed. The soil is eroding. The nearby woodlands are being depleted for construction, for fuel, for the constant fires needed for cooking and metalworking. This is what ecologists call overshoot, when a population exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment. And once you're in overshoot, you're vulnerable. If the rains are good, you might get by. But if there's a drought, and the climate data suggests there are droughts in this period, then you're in serious trouble. The cattle start dying. The crops fail. Food becomes scarce. And when food becomes scarce in a centralized state that depends on tribute and redistribution, the whole system starts to crack. But environmental stress alone doesn't usually kill a civilization. What it does is create vulnerabilities. It weakens the state's ability to maintain control. It undermines the prestige and legitimacy of the rulers. If the Mambo cannot ensure prosperity, if the ancestors seem to have withdrawn their favor, then why should the outlying territories continue to pay tribute? Why should the people continue to support the system? And there's another factor: trade shifts. The coastal trade network that has been so lucrative for Great Zimbabwe is changing. New powers are rising. The kingdom of Mutapa is emerging to the north, controlling access to trade routes and salt pans. The kingdom of Torwa is developing to the south, with its own stone-built capital at Kami. These successor states are fragmenting Great Zimbabwe's economic base, drawing trade and tribute away from the old capital. Think of it like this. Great Zimbabwe's power was built on being the middleman. Goods from the interior flowed through Great Zimbabwe to the coast. Trade goods from the coast flowed through Great Zimbabwe to the interior. The rulers took their cut. But if alternative routes open up, if other centers of power establish their own trade connections, then Great Zimbabwe's monopoly is broken. The economic foundation crumbles. There's also likely a political dimension. In any complex society, there are competing factions, rival lineages, ambitious nobles who think they could do a better job. When things are going well, the system holds together. When there's crisis, those tensions erupt. We don't have detailed records of internal politics at Great Zimbabwe, but we can infer from patterns elsewhere. Succession disputes, power struggles, ambitious Vazungas who decide to break away and establish their own centers of power. The collapse when it comes is not sudden. This isn't a city sacked by invaders. There's no evidence of warfare, no burn layers, no mass graves. Instead, it's a slow abandonment. People drift away. The population declines. The great construction projects cease. The trade network reconfigures around new centers. By the middle of the 15th century, maybe by 1450 or so, Great Zimbabwe is no longer the capital. The mambo has moved. The city doesn't die entirely. People continue to live in the area, using the structures, maintaining some level of occupation. But the power, the wealth, the centralized state, that's gone. The successor states inherit different pieces of Great Zimbabwe's legacy. The Mutapa kingdom to the north becomes the dominant power in the region. Its rulers claim descent from the rulers of Great Zimbabwe, maintaining the legitimacy that comes with that connection. The Portuguese, arriving on the East African coast in the early 1500s, encounter the Mutapa kingdom and are impressed by its organization and wealth. They call its ruler the Monomotapa. Their corruption of the Shona title Mwene Mutapa, master of the tribute. The Portuguese explorers and traders hear stories of Great Zimbabwe. They're told about the stone ruins in the interior. Some of these accounts are fantastical, filled with exaggerations about gold and riches, but they confirm that the ruins exist and that they're associated with a powerful past civilization. The Portuguese even make some attempts to reach the ruins, though the difficult terrain and the resistance of African kingdoms generally keep them on the coast. To the southwest, the Torwa kingdom establishes its capital at Kami, building impressive stone structures that clearly draw on Great Zimbabwe's architectural tradition, but develop their own distinctive styles. The stone walls at Kami use different techniques, decorative patterns, retaining walls for terrace platforms. It's an evolution of the tradition, not a degeneration. And here's a crucial point that often gets lost in discussions of Great Zimbabwe's abandonment. The tradition doesn't die. The Shona people continue to build in stone. The political systems evolve but maintain continuity. The religious practices persist. The oral traditions preserve the memory of Great Zimbabwe's greatness. This isn't a civilization that vanishes. It's a civilization that transforms, that adapts to new circumstances, that continues in different forms. But Great Zimbabwe itself, the great stone city, gradually becomes a sacred site rather than a living capital. The Shona continue to recognize it as a place of power, a place of the ancestors. Chiefs and rulers come here for certain ceremonies. People leave offerings. The site maintains its spiritual significance even as its political importance fades. And then for centuries, Great Zimbabwe recedes from the wider world's attention. European maps of Africa mark vast interior spaces as blank, terra incognita. The African kingdoms of the interior continue their complex histories of rise and fall, warfare and trade, drought and prosperity. But Europe doesn't know about them. Europe doesn't care. Until the colonial era, until the scramble for Africa, until Europeans once again encounter these ruins and refuse to believe what they're seeing. We've already discussed the early European responses, the denial, the racist theories, the looting. But let's focus on something more insidious. What happens when the lie becomes institutionalized? Rhodesia, the colonial state established by Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company, explicitly uses the myth of Great Zimbabwe in its propaganda. The colonial government promotes the idea that these ruins were built by ancient Phoenicians or Arabs or Israelites, anyone but Black Africans. And they do this not just out of casual racism, but as a deliberate political strategy. Think about the logic. If Africans never built anything of significance, if they have no history of complex civilization, then European colonialism is actually bringing civilization to a primitive land. It's the white man's burden. It's justified. But if Africans did build this, if they had sophisticated kingdoms and trade networks and impressive architecture, then colonialism is simply conquest and exploitation. The moral foundation crumbles. So the Rhodesian government actively suppresses African history. In schools, black children are taught that their ancestors were primitive. White children are taught the same. The connection between the Shona people and Great Zimbabwe is denied, minimized, or ignored. When archaeologists try to publish research supporting African origin, the government prevents it or attacks it. Access to the site is controlled. The narrative is controlled. And this has consequences. It shapes how Africans see themselves. It shapes how the world sees Africa. Even today, many people are surprised to learn about Great Zimbabwe. They've never heard of it. They have no mental framework for understanding that Africa had complex civilizations. They've been taught explicitly or implicitly that African history is simple, primitive, lacking in achievement. This is the power of historical erasure. It's not just about the past, it's about the present. It's about who gets to have pride in their heritage. It's about who gets to claim legitimacy. It's about power. But history has a way of fighting back. The truth, as they say, will out. And in the case of Great Zimbabwe, the truth emerges not just through archaeology, but through political liberation. If you're still watching at this point, you're clearly enjoying this journey into one of history's greatest cover-ups. Take a second right now to hit that subscribe button, because there are hundreds of untold African stories like this one, and we're bringing them all to light. The 1960s and 70s bring winds of change to Africa. Across the continent, colonial empires are collapsing. Countries are gaining independence, and with independence comes a reclamation of history. People who were told they had no past are rediscovering their heritage, reasserting their identity, reclaiming their monuments. In Rhodesia, soon to be Zimbabwe, this process is particularly charged. The white minority government, led by Ian Smith, unilaterally declares independence from Britain in 1965, determined to maintain white rule. A brutal bush war ensues. African liberation movements, ZANU and ZAPU, fight for majority rule. And in this struggle, Great Zimbabwe becomes a symbol. The liberation fighters call themselves the Zimbabwe African National Union. They invoke the name of the ancient civilization. They print images of the soapstone birds on their propaganda. They tell their supporters, "We are reclaiming our heritage. We are the heirs of Great Zimbabwe. We built this. This is ours, and it's powerful. It's galvanizing, and it works." When Zimbabwe finally gains independence in 1980, the new nation chooses its name deliberately. Not Rhodesia, the name of the colonizer. Zimbabwe, the name rooted in the ancient civilization. The flag features the soapstone bird. The coat of arms features Great Zimbabwe. The site itself becomes a national monument, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a place of pilgrimage for Zimbabweans reconnecting with their history. I want you to imagine what this means. Imagine growing up being told your ancestors built nothing, achieved nothing, were nothing, and then discovering, or rather rediscovering, because your grandparents always knew, that your ancestors built one of the great civilizations of the medieval world, that they traded with China and India, that they created architectural marvels, that they were sophisticated, powerful, wealthy. This is more than historical knowledge. This is identity. This is pride. This is reclamation. And the archaeological work continues, now with African involvement. Zimbabwean archaeologists begin studying their own heritage. The research becomes more nuanced, more sophisticated. New techniques are applied. Radiocarbon dating confirms the medieval dating. Archaeological surveys map the full extent of the settlement. Excavations in undisturbed areas reveal new details about daily life, trade, and social organization. We now know that Great Zimbabwe was occupied from around the 11th century to the mid-15th century, with its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. We know that it was the capital of a state that controlled trade between the interior goldfields and the East African coast. We know that its population may have reached 18,000 at its height. We know that it traded with the Islamic world, India, and China. We know that it was built by the ancestors of the Shona people using indigenous architectural traditions. We know all of this not because of European archaeology in the colonial era, but despite it, and because of African and international scholarship in the post-colonial period. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Because even as Great Zimbabwe is being reclaimed as a symbol of African achievement, new controversies emerge. And these controversies reveal something profound about the politics of history, the complexity of truth, and the ongoing struggle over who gets to tell Africa's story. In the 1980s and 90s, a debate erupts among scholars about the nature of Great Zimbabwe's economy. Some researchers, particularly those influenced by Marxist analysis, argue that Great Zimbabwe was an exploitative state. They point out that the wealth of the elite was built on the labor of commoners, that the gold and ivory traded to the coast came from workers who saw little of the profit, that the hierarchical society of Great Zimbabwe was fundamentally unequal. Others push back, arguing that this framing imposes Western concepts of exploitation onto African societies. They point out that in Shona society, hierarchy and tribute were balanced by reciprocal obligations. The Mambo wasn't just extracting wealth, he was redistributing it, providing protection, ensuring spiritual well-being through his connection to the ancestors. The system was more complex than simple exploitation. This might seem like an academic debate, but it has real implications. Because in newly independent Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe is being held up as a symbol of African greatness. Political leaders invoke it constantly. And if Great Zimbabwe was actually an exploitative state, if it enriched elites at the expense of common people, then what does that say about modern Zimbabwe's political system, which often operates in similar ways? The first decades of Zimbabwe's independence are turbulent. Robert Mugabe's government, which led the liberation struggle, becomes increasingly authoritarian. Political opponents are suppressed. The economy struggles. And through it all, Great Zimbabwe remains a potent symbol, invoked by the government to legitimize its rule. We are the inheritors of this great civilization, the message goes. We have historical legitimacy. But symbols can be complicated. Great Zimbabwe represents African achievement, yes, but it also represents questions that every society must grapple with. How is power exercised? Who benefits? What happens when a society exceeds its environmental limits? What causes great civilizations to collapse? Let's dig deeper into what we've learned about Great Zimbabwe society, because the picture that emerges from recent archaeology is fascinatingly complex. The layout of the city itself reveals social organization. The hill complex, perched high on the granite outcrop, is clearly elite space. This is where the Mambo resides, where the most elaborate stone structures are found, where the famous soapstone birds were placed. The restriction of access, the elaborate passageways, the commanding views, all of this speaks to sacred kingship, to a ruler set apart. The great enclosure below is also elite space, though its exact function remains debated. Some scholars believe it was the residence of the Mambo's principal wife or wives. Others think it might have housed important nobles or served ceremonial functions. The sheer scale of it, those massive walls, that mysterious conical tower, suggests it was deeply important to the society's self-conception. But then there are the hundreds of smaller enclosures scattered across the landscape. These are where ordinary people lived. And here's what's interesting. There's variation in these commoner houses too. Some have more elaborate stone walls. Some have more imported goods. There's a middle class, essentially. People who aren't royalty but who are doing well enough to invest in stone construction and imported luxuries. The distribution of trade goods is particularly revealing. Yes, the elite have more imported items, more gold jewelry, more elaborate pottery, more exotic beads, but commoners have some too. This suggests that wealth, while concentrated at the top, was distributed more broadly than in many hierarchical societies. It suggests a prosperous economy that created opportunities for social mobility, at least to some degree. The religious system also reveals complexity. The Mambo's power is sacred, derived from his connection to the ancestors. But he doesn't have absolute power. He must consult spirit mediums. He must maintain the favor of the ancestors through proper ritual and moral behavior. If drought comes, if cattle die, if trade falters, this is interpreted as a sign that the Mambo has lost the ancestors' favor, and when that happens, his legitimacy crumbles. This is actually a check on power, built into the religious system. The Mambo cannot simply do whatever he wants. He must perform his role correctly, must maintain cosmic balance, must ensure prosperity. If he fails, he can be removed. In this sense, the system has an accountability mechanism, even if it's not what we call democratic. The economy of Great Zimbabwe is also more sophisticated than simple extraction. Yes, there's tribute flowing to the capital from outlying areas, but there's also redistribution. The Mambo gives cattle to loyal followers. He sponsors feasts. He provides gifts to visitors. He maintains the religious sites. This is what anthropologists call a prestige economy. The elite accumulate wealth, but they're also expected to be generous, to demonstrate their status through giving. And the trade itself requires complex organization. Merchants from the coast need to be hosted, protected, guided to the gold sources. Miners need to be coordinated, their gold collected and refined. Craftsmen need to be supported. The whole system requires bureaucratic infrastructure, officials who can keep records, make decisions, enforce agreements. We don't know exactly how this bureaucracy functioned because we don't have written records from Great Zimbabwe itself. The Shona didn't have a writing system, but the archaeological evidence of their trade connections suggests impressive organizational capability. You don't trade with China without sophisticated logistics. And let's talk more about those trade connections because they're genuinely remarkable. Glass beads found at Great Zimbabwe come from Persia and India. Chinese ceramics, celadon, and blue and white porcelain date to the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. These are high-quality pieces, not cheap trade goods. There are glass beads from as far away as Europe. There are cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. There's copper from Central Africa. There's tin, likely imported, for making bronze. This is a civilization plugged into the medieval world economy. And here's the crucial point. They're not passive recipients of trade. They're active participants. They have commodities that the world wants, gold and ivory especially. They negotiate terms. They accumulate wealth. They choose what to buy with that wealth. When Great Zimbabwe's traders obtain Chinese ceramics, they're making aesthetic choices. They like these pieces. They value them. They display them as prestige goods. This is cultural exchange, not one-way influence. Great Zimbabwe is shaping and being shaped by its connections to the wider world. And yet, for centuries, the world forgot this. Or rather, the world was told to forget it. The racist ideology of colonialism required that Africa be primitive, isolated, incapable of such achievements. So the evidence was ignored, denied, or attributed to non-Africans. The psychological damage this caused is incalculable. Think about generations of African children taught to be ashamed of their heritage, taught that they came from the dark continent with no history worth knowing. Think about how this shaped African self-conception, how it justified oppression, how it created internalized racism that persists even today. But think also about what this reveals about European psychology. The refusal to accept Great Zimbabwe's African origins wasn't just about Africans. It was about Europeans needing to believe in their own superiority. It was about constructing a worldview in which Europeans were the uniquely civilized people, the bringers of progress, the masters of history. Great Zimbabwe shattered that myth, and the violence of the reaction, the academic attacks, the censorship, the institutional suppression of truth, reveals how desperately Europeans clung to that myth. But here's what they couldn't suppress. The stones themselves. The walls still stand. The ruins endure. You can visit them today. You can walk those ancient passages. You can run your hand along granite blocks fitted together 700 years ago. You can stand in the great enclosure and feel the weight of history pressing down on you. The stones don't lie. The stones can't be rewritten. The stones are testimony to African achievement, African sophistication, African greatness. And the stones are teaching us new things still. Recent archaeological work using new technologies is revealing details that earlier excavations missed. Ground-penetrating radar is finding structures that were never excavated. Drone photography is revealing patterns in the landscape. Archaeobotany, the study of ancient plant remains, is telling us about diet, agriculture, and environmental change. Metallurgical analysis is revealing sophisticated techniques in iron and gold working. One fascinating recent discovery: evidence of astronomical alignments at Great Zimbabwe. The hill complex seems to have been carefully oriented to solar and stellar phenomena. Certain passages frame the rising or setting sun at solstices. This suggests that Great Zimbabwe's builders had sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, that the city was designed not just for practical purposes, but as a cosmological statement, linking earthly power to celestial order. This shouldn't surprise us. Many ancient civilizations incorporated astronomical knowledge into their architecture. Stonehenge, the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, Angkor Wat. Great Zimbabwe was doing the same thing. This was a society that observed the heavens, tracked the seasons, encoded that knowledge in stone. Another area of ongoing research: the environmental impact and recovery. Scientists are studying pollen cores, looking at how vegetation changed around Great Zimbabwe before, during, and after its occupation. They're studying soil erosion and recovery patterns. And what they're finding is instructive. Yes, Great Zimbabwe's large population stressed the local environment. But after the site was abandoned, the ecosystem recovered. The plateau is once again lush, wooded, thriving. This tells us something important. The collapse wasn't permanent environmental destruction. It was overshoot followed by recovery. The land could support that population, but not indefinitely without better management. And when the population declined, the land healed. There's a lesson here for our modern world as we face our own environmental challenges. Great civilizations can stress their environments to the breaking point, but ecosystems are also resilient if given the chance to recover. The story of Great Zimbabwe isn't just about past glory. It's about the relationship between human societies and the natural world, about sustainability and carrying capacity in the consequences of growth. But let's return to the question of legacy. What does Great Zimbabwe mean today? Not just for Zimbabwe, not just for Africa, but for all of us. First, it's a reminder that history is always being written and rewritten. The facts we learn are shaped by who's doing the teaching and why. For over a century, people were taught lies about Great Zimbabwe. Today, we know better. But we should ask, what else are we being told that's wrong? What other histories have been suppressed or distorted? Second, it's a corrective to Eurocentric history. The narrative most of us learned in school is that civilization developed in the Middle East, spread to Europe, and then Europeans brought civilization to the rest of the world. This is simply false. Civilizations developed independently all over the world, in China, in India, in Mesoamerica, in West Africa, in Southeast Asia. And these civilizations were often in contact with each other, trading, exchanging ideas, influencing each other. Great Zimbabwe was part of a medieval world system that stretched from China to Africa. Understanding this changes how we see world history. Third, it's a testament to human creativity and achievement. The people who built Great Zimbabwe solved complex problems. How do you organize a city of thousands? How do you coordinate long-distance trade? How do you construct massive stone walls without mortar? How do you maintain social cohesion? How do you create meaning and beauty? Great Zimbabwe's builders answered these questions in their own distinctive ways, creating something unique and magnificent. Fourth, it's a warning about hubris and sustainability. Great Zimbabwe rose to greatness, but it also fell. The civilization that seemed so powerful, so wealthy, so permanent, it didn't last. Environmental stress, political fragmentation, economic shifts, the combination proved too much. This isn't unique to Great Zimbabwe. It's a pattern we see throughout history. Rome fell. The Maya city-states collapsed. Easter Island civilization imploded. No civilization is immune to the consequences of unsustainable practices. But here's the fifth lesson, and maybe the most important: cultural continuity. Great Zimbabwe didn't disappear. The people didn't vanish. The Shona continued. The traditions evolved. The stone building techniques persisted at Kami and other sites. The oral histories preserve the memory. The religious practices maintain continuity. This is resilience. This is the ability of a culture to survive even when its political structures collapse. Today, millions of Shona people live in Zimbabwe and beyond. They speak languages descended from the language spoken at Great Zimbabwe. They practice religions that evolved from the ancestor veneration of Great Zimbabwe. They maintain cultural practices with roots in that ancient civilization. Great Zimbabwe isn't just a ruin, it's a living heritage. And increasingly, it's being recognized as such. Zimbabwean archaeologists are training new generations of researchers. Cultural heritage programs are working with local communities to preserve and interpret the site. Tourism brings visitors from around the world. Though the site deserves many more visitors than it gets. Great Zimbabwe should be as famous as Machu Picchu, as Angkor Wat, as Petra. It's every bit as impressive. But because of the historical erasure, because of centuries of denial, it remains less known than it should be. That's changing. African history is increasingly being taught in schools around the world. Documentaries are being made. Books are being written. The story of Great Zimbabwe is reaching new audiences. And every time someone learns about it, every time someone understands what was achieved here, it chips away at the racist myth that Africa has no history. But we need to be careful about how we tell this story. There's a temptation to overcorrect, to present Great Zimbabwe as some kind of perfect society, to romanticize it. That doesn't serve the truth. Great Zimbabwe was a real human society with all the complexity that entails. It had hierarchy and inequality. It exploited natural resources. It was probably involved in regional conflicts. The ivory trade that brought it wealth also meant the deaths of countless elephants. The gold that flowed through its markets was mined by people doing dangerous work. We can acknowledge these complexities while still recognizing achievement. We can be honest about the full picture while still taking pride in what was accomplished. That's what mature historical understanding looks like. Not hagiography, not denial, but nuanced appreciation of human societies in all their messy complexity. And there's one more thing we need to talk about, one more twist in the story of Great Zimbabwe that brings us right up to the present day. Because the site itself, the physical ruins, are facing new threats. And how Zimbabwe and the world respond to these threats will determine whether Great Zimbabwe survives for future generations. The stones of Great Zimbabwe have stood for 7 centuries. They've survived abandonment, rediscovery, colonial looting, and independence. But now they face threats that are, in some ways, more insidious than anything they've faced before. First, there's the threat of poor management and neglect. Zimbabwe's post-independence history has been troubled. Economic crises, political turmoil, currency collapse. These national problems affect everything, including heritage preservation. The Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority manages Great Zimbabwe as a national monument, but funding is chronically inadequate. Staff are underpaid. Conservation work is deferred. Maintenance is minimal. The result? Some walls are deteriorating. Vegetation growth, if not controlled, can damage stone structures as roots work their way into cracks. Water erosion is an ongoing concern. Some areas that were badly excavated in the colonial era have never been properly restored. The site needs constant care, and it's not always getting it. Second, there's the threat of inappropriate development. Great Zimbabwe is surrounded by a modern community. People live here. They farm, they run businesses, they go about their lives. And as the population grows, there's pressure for development, roads, buildings, infrastructure. Some of this encroaches on the archaeological landscape, potentially damaging unexcavated areas. There's a constant tension between the needs of living communities and the preservation of heritage. Third, there's the threat of looting. This isn't colonial-era sanctioned looting anymore. This is illicit trade in antiquities. People looking to make money dig up artifacts and sell them on the black market. This is less of a problem at Great Zimbabwe itself, which is guarded, but at outlying sites associated with the Great Zimbabwe culture. Looting is an ongoing issue. Fourth, there's the threat of climate change. Remember, Great Zimbabwe's collapse was partly driven by environmental stress, drought, overgrazing, resource depletion. Today, climate change is making droughts more severe and more frequent in southern Africa. This affects the landscape around Great Zimbabwe. It affects vegetation. It can affect the stone structures themselves through increased weathering. And fifth, there's a more subtle threat: the politicization of heritage. In Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe has been used as a political symbol by various governments. Sometimes this is benign, national pride, cultural celebration. Sometimes it's more problematic, leaders using Great Zimbabwe to legitimize authoritarian practices, claiming they're the true heirs of ancient greatness even as they undermine democracy. This politicization can actually harm preservation. If a site becomes too closely associated with a particular political party or leader, then when that party or leader falls from favor, the site can suffer from political backlash. Heritage should belong to all people, not to political factions. But let's not be entirely pessimistic. There are also positive developments in Great Zimbabwe's preservation and interpretation. UNESCO designated Great Zimbabwe as a World Heritage Site in 1986. This brings international attention and, theoretically, support for preservation. It also sets standards for management. While implementation has been imperfect, the designation is important for raising the site's global profile. Local communities are increasingly involved in heritage management. There's growing recognition that the people who live around Great Zimbabwe, many of whom are descendants of the builders, should have a voice in how the site is managed and interpreted. Community-based tourism initiatives are developing. Local guides are being trained. Cultural festivals at the site are celebrating Shona heritage. Academic research continues. International collaborations between Zimbabwean institutions and foreign universities are producing new knowledge. And importantly, there's emphasis on training Zimbabwean archaeologists and heritage professionals. This is crucial for long-term sustainability. Heritage management should be led by people from the culture that created the heritage. Digital preservation is also happening. The site has been extensively photographed, mapped, and documented. 3D scanning technology is creating detailed digital models. This means that even if the physical site faces threats, there will be detailed records preserved, and these digital models can be used for education, research, and even virtual tourism. There's also increasing tourism potential. Great Zimbabwe receives visitors, but far fewer than it should. Zimbabwe's political and economic challenges have discouraged tourism. But as stability improves, there's potential for significant growth. And tourism, if managed sustainably, can provide both funding for preservation and economic incentive for local communities to support heritage conservation. The Zimbabwean diaspora, millions of Zimbabweans living abroad, are also increasingly engaged with their heritage. Many have never visited Great Zimbabwe but take pride in it. Some are supporting preservation efforts financially. Others are raising awareness internationally. This diaspora engagement is a powerful resource for heritage preservation. And perhaps most importantly, there's a generational shift happening. Young Zimbabweans are reclaiming their history with a passion that transcends politics. They're using social media to share images of Great Zimbabwe. They're writing about it, making art about it, incorporating it into music and literature. This grassroots cultural reclamation is powerful precisely because it's not top-down. It's organic, it's authentic. But let's zoom out and ask a bigger question. Why should the world care about Great Zimbabwe? Why should people in Lagos or London or Los Angeles give a damn about ruins in Southern Africa? Here's why. Because every time we lose a piece of human heritage, we all lose something. Great Zimbabwe is part of the human story. It's evidence of what humans can achieve. It's a reminder that civilization has flowered in many places, in many forms. It's proof that history is far richer and more complex than the simplified narratives we're often told. When we preserve Great Zimbabwe, we're not just preserving stones. We're preserving knowledge. We're preserving identity for people who descend from that civilization. We're preserving evidence that challenges racist narratives. We're preserving inspiration for future generations who need to know that their ancestors built great things. And we're preserving humility. Because Great Zimbabwe also reminds us that even great civilizations can fall, that environmental limits are real, that political systems can fail, that nothing is permanent. These are lessons every generation needs to relearn. There's also an economic argument for preservation. Heritage tourism is big business globally. Sites like Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, and Petra generate enormous revenue for their countries. Great Zimbabwe has that potential. With proper investment in infrastructure, marketing, and site management, it could draw hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. That's jobs, that's revenue, that's economic development for a country that desperately needs it. But the economic argument, while valid, shouldn't be the only one. Some things have value beyond money. Some things are worth preserving simply because they're extraordinary, because they're beautiful, because they're part of the human heritage that belongs to all of us. Let me tell you about a moment that captures what Great Zimbabwe means. In 1980, when Zimbabwe gained independence, the new government held a ceremony at Great Zimbabwe. Liberation fighters who had fought for freedom gathered in the ancient enclosures. They sang, they danced, they celebrated. Elders who remembered when they were told these ruins couldn't have been built by Africans stood in those ancient passageways and wept. Imagine what that felt like. Imagine the weight of that moment. Your entire life you've been told you're inferior. You've been told your people never built anything, never achieved anything. You fought a war to overthrow that lie, to reclaim your dignity. And now you're standing in the ruins of a city your ancestors built, a city that proves everything you were told was false. You're standing in the evidence of your own greatness. That's what Great Zimbabwe represents. Not just for Zimbabweans, for all Africans, for all people who've been told they're lesser, that their history doesn't matter, that their ancestors achieved nothing. Great Zimbabwe is a granite testimony to the lie of racial inferiority. But it's also more than that. It's a connection to the past that all humans need. We all want to know where we came from. We all want to feel connected to something larger than ourselves. We all need our stories. And Great Zimbabwe has many stories still to tell. Despite over a century of archaeological work, much remains unknown. Large sections have never been excavated. Questions remain about specific functions of certain structures. The full extent of the settlement area is still being mapped. New technologies keep revealing new information. Every excavation season brings surprises. A few years ago, archaeologists found evidence of beer brewing at Great Zimbabwe, large ceramic vessels with residue matching traditional sorghum beer. This might seem trivial, but it's not. It tells us about social life, about feasting, about ritual. Beer in African cultures isn't just alcohol. It's part of social bonding, religious ceremony, political negotiation. Finding evidence of beer brewing tells us about how people actually lived, how they celebrated, how they built community. Other recent finds include more evidence of the site's international connections, a Persian pot lid, more Chinese ceramics, glass beads from Europe. Each find adds detail to our understanding of Great Zimbabwe's place in the medieval world system. And there are mysteries that may never be fully solved. What exactly was the conical tower for? Why that specific shape? Why solid rather than hollow? We have theories. It might represent a grain bin, a symbol of prosperity, or it might be phallic, a fertility symbol, or it might be purely aesthetic, a statement of architectural ambition. We don't know for certain, and maybe that's okay. Maybe every great monument should keep some secrets. The soapstone birds also retain their mystery. We know they were important. We know they were deliberately placed in the eastern enclosure. We know they likely represented something sacred, ancestors perhaps, or spiritual intermediaries. But the exact meaning, the specific symbolism, the rituals associated with them, much of this is lost. The oral traditions preserve some hints, but not the full story. This loss of specific meaning is partly due to the disruption of colonialism. When societies are conquered, when their practices are suppressed, when their knowledge keepers die, information is lost. The soapstone birds were taken from Great Zimbabwe in the 1890s. Most ended up in museums in Cape Town and elsewhere. Only in recent decades have some been returned to Zimbabwe. This theft wasn't just about objects. It was about severing connections, about breaking the chain of cultural transmission. But cultures are resilient. The Shona didn't forget Great Zimbabwe even when they were told to. They maintained their connection even when it was dangerous. And today, that connection is being strengthened, formalized, celebrated. There's a movement now to decolonize archaeology, to decolonize museums, to decolonize knowledge itself. This means involving descendant communities in decisions about heritage. It means repatriating stolen artifacts. It means acknowledging that Western academia doesn't have a monopoly on truth, that local knowledge and oral traditions are valid forms of evidence. For Great Zimbabwe, this means Shona elders and spiritual leaders are consulted about site management. It means traditional ceremonies at the site are respected and facilitated. It means the interpretation of the site incorporates Shona perspectives, not just Western archaeological frameworks. This is still a work in progress. There are tensions between different ways of knowing, different types of authority. Academic archaeologists have their methodologies and standards. Traditional authorities have their knowledge and spiritual insights. Finding ways for these different knowledge systems to coexist and complement each other is challenging, but essential. And it's happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but it's happening. At Great Zimbabwe and at other heritage sites around Africa, there's a renegotiation of who has the authority to interpret the past. This is what decolonization looks like in practice. It's messy, it's contentious, but it's necessary. Because ultimately, Great Zimbabwe doesn't belong to archaeologists or tourists or even to the government of Zimbabwe. It belongs to the people whose ancestors built it. It belongs to the Shona people. And while they're generous in sharing it with the world, and they should, because it's a site of global significance, the primary stakeholders must be the communities who have maintained their connection to this place across centuries. This brings us to a critical moment. We're standing at a crossroads in Great Zimbabwe's story. The site has survived 7 centuries. It's survived abandonment, colonialism, and independence. But will it survive the challenges of the 21st century? That depends on choices being made right now. Choices about funding, choices about management, choices about development, choices about climate action, choices about decolonization and community involvement. These aren't just Zimbabwean choices, they're global choices. Because Great Zimbabwe is a World Heritage Site, it belongs to all humanity, and all humanity has some responsibility for its preservation. But here's where the story takes its final, most shocking turn. Because there's one more revelation about Great Zimbabwe that changes everything we thought we knew. One more discovery that forces us to reconsider not just this site, but the entire history of Southern Africa. In 2019, a team of archaeologists made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the academic world. They were excavating at a site called Mapungubwe, about 250 miles southwest of Great Zimbabwe. Mapungubwe was another stone-built settlement, earlier than Great Zimbabwe, dated to around 1300 CE. What they found challenged everything scholars thought they knew about the chronology and development of complex societies in southern Africa. They found evidence of sophisticated gold-working dating to the early 11th century, earlier than previously thought. They found trade goods connecting Mapungubwe to the Indian Ocean world generations before Great Zimbabwe rose to prominence. And most strikingly, they found architectural techniques and decorative motifs that would later appear at Great Zimbabwe. The revelation was this: Great Zimbabwe wasn't the first. It wasn't even unique. It was the culmination of a much longer tradition of state formation and urban development in southern Africa. Mapungubwe wasn't alone either. Archaeologists have identified dozens of stone-built settlements across the Zimbabwe Plateau and beyond. Sites like Kami, Danangom, Nalatal, and many others. Some predate Great Zimbabwe. Some are contemporary with it. Some are later part of the successor states. What emerges from this research is a picture of a dynamic, complex region with multiple centers of power, competing and cooperating, rising and falling over centuries. Great Zimbabwe was the largest and most powerful, but it was part of a network, not an isolated phenomenon. This changes our understanding fundamentally. For decades, scholars treated Great Zimbabwe as an anomaly, something that needed explanation. How did this one extraordinary site emerge? But if we understand it as part of a broader pattern, a culmination of long-term trends in urbanization, state formation, and economic development, then it makes much more sense. The story becomes, over centuries, farming communities on the Zimbabwe plateau developed increasingly complex societies. Population grew, agricultural surplus increased, trade networks expanded, hierarchies deepened. Some settlements became centers of power. Competition between these centers drove innovation in architecture, in administration, in trade organization. Great Zimbabwe eventually emerged as the dominant center, perhaps because of geographic advantages, perhaps because of particularly able leadership, perhaps because of historical contingency. But here's what's truly shocking. When you map all these sites, when you trace the trade networks, when you document the architectural traditions, you realize that what we're looking at isn't just a kingdom, it's a civilization. A civilization comparable to others around the world. A civilization with multiple urban centers, extensive trade networks, sophisticated architecture, complex political organization, and centuries of development. A civilization that rivals anything in medieval Europe or anywhere else. This is the revelation that changes everything. Southern Africa between roughly 1000 CE and 1500 CE was home to a major civilization. Not a single kingdom, not an isolated city, a civilization. Scholars are now calling it the Zimbabwe culture or the Zimbabwe civilization. And it's becoming clear that this civilization was far more extensive, far more sophisticated, and far more important in world history than previously recognized. Let's trace this civilization's full extent. At its height, the Zimbabwe culture's influence stretched from the Zambezi River in the north to the Limpopo River in the south, from the eastern highlands to the Kalahari Desert in the west. That's an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles. Within this zone, you find stone-built settlements, shared architectural styles, connected trade networks, similar pottery traditions, and evidence of political and economic integration. This wasn't a centralized empire like Rome. It was more like a cultural zone with multiple competing and cooperating polities, similar to ancient Greece or the Maya city-states. Great Zimbabwe was the most powerful center during its peak, but it didn't directly control everything. Other centers had autonomy, paid tribute when Great Zimbabwe was strong, asserted independence when it was weak. The trade networks of this civilization extended thousands of miles. Gold, ivory, and iron flowed east to the Swahili coast. From there, African goods reached Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. In return, glass beads, cloth, ceramics, and other luxury goods flowed west into the interior. This wasn't peripheral trade. This was major commerce, significant enough that when Portuguese traders reached the East African coast in the 1500s, they found a well-established trading system that Africans controlled. The Portuguese tried to take over this trade. They established forts on the coast. They sent expeditions into the interior. They made alliances with some African rulers against others, but they never gained control. The African kingdoms were too powerful, too organized. The Mutapa Kingdom, Great Zimbabwe's successor, maintained its independence and continued to dominate the gold trade for centuries. This is a crucial point that often gets lost. Even after European contact, even after the Portuguese arrived with their guns and ships, the African kingdoms of the interior remained independent and powerful. Colonization of southern Africa didn't happen until the 19th century, 300 years after first contact. This wasn't because Europeans were benevolent. It was because African states were strong enough to resist. The Zimbabwe civilization's achievements in architecture are now recognized as world-class. The stone-building tradition, refined over centuries, produced structures of remarkable sophistication. The walls are not just piled stones. They're carefully constructed using select granite blocks, fitted without mortar, using techniques of coursing and bonding that require significant engineering knowledge. The largest structures, the Great Enclosure at Great Zimbabwe, the Hill Complex, the major buildings at Kami and other sites, represent hundreds of thousands of person-hours of labor. They require planning, organization, skilled craftsmen, and resource mobilization on a massive scale. This is state-level organization, comparable to what we see in other ancient civilizations. The art of the Zimbabwe civilization is also increasingly recognized. The soapstone birds are masterpieces of sculpture, stylized yet naturalistic, beautiful and mysterious. Other sculptures have been found, human figures, abstract forms. The goldwork, though much was looted, shows sophisticated metalworking techniques. The pottery tradition includes elaborately decorated pieces with complex geometric patterns. And the agriculture. Recent research shows that farmers of the Zimbabwe culture practice sophisticated crop rotation, use terracing in hilly areas, and manage cattle herds with careful breeding. This wasn't subsistence farming. This was productive agriculture generating significant surplus, enabling urbanization and specialization. The social organization was complex. Beyond the mambo and the elite, there were multiple layers of society: nobles, priests, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, herders. There was likely slavery too, though the nature and extent is debated. Captives from wars might have been enslaved. Tribute might have included people. But this seems to have been different from the chattel slavery that would later devastate Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. Gender roles are harder to reconstruct, but there's evidence that women held significant positions. Some of the soapstone birds have been interpreted as female figures. Oral traditions speak of powerful queens and queen mothers. Women certainly participated in agriculture, craft production, and trade. The Shona have traditions of female spirit mediums and ritual specialists, likely extending back to the Great Zimbabwe period. The religious life was rich. Beyond the ancestor veneration we've discussed, there was worship of Mwari, the supreme creator deity. Sacred sites dotted the landscape: caves, mountains, springs. Rainmaking ceremonies were crucial in this semi-arid environment. The Mambo's legitimacy partly rested on his ability to ensure rain. Priests and ritual specialists communicated with the spirit world through possession, divination, and sacrifice. All of this, the political structure, the economy, the architecture, the art, the religion, the social organization, constitutes a civilization. Not a primitive society, not a simple culture, a civilization. And yet, for over a century, the world was told this didn't exist. Africans were incapable of this. The ruins must have been built by outsiders. The achievements must be attributed to non-Africans. The psychological impact of this denial cannot be overstated. Imagine being told your entire life that your ancestors achieved nothing, only to discover they built a civilization that rivaled any in the world. Imagine the generations of African children who grew up ashamed of their heritage, who internalized the racism, who believed the lies. And imagine the Europeans who constructed and maintained these lies. What does it say about them? What does it reveal about the fragility of their claims to superiority that they had to deny African achievement to maintain their self-conception? This is why Great Zimbabwe matters. It's not just about the past. It's about how the past is used in the present. It's about who gets to have history, who gets to claim achievement, who gets to have pride in their heritage. The decolonization of history is an ongoing project. In schools around the world, African history is still marginalized. Students learn in detail about ancient Greece and Rome, about medieval Europe, about Asian dynasties. But Africa, often reduced to Egypt, conveniently separated from sub-Saharan Africa, as if the Sahara is some impermeable barrier. And then slavery and colonialism, as if nothing else happened. As if an entire continent produced nothing of significance for thousands of years. This is absurd, and it's deeply harmful, because when you erase people's history, you erase their humanity. You make it easier to exploit them, to dismiss them, to treat them as less than fully human. Great Zimbabwe and the broader Zimbabwe civilization force us to confront this erasure. They demand that we rewrite the narrative. They insist that African history be taken seriously, be taught properly, be given the same respect as the history of any other region. And there's more. Recent research is revealing that the Zimbabwe civilization's influence extended even further than previously thought. Trade goods bearing Zimbabwe culture characteristics have been found as far south as South Africa, as far west as Botswana, as far north as Tanzania. This civilization's economic and cultural reach was vast. There's also evidence of knowledge exchange. Architectural techniques from Great Zimbabwe appear at sites hundreds of miles away. Pottery styles spread, religious practices diffused. This suggests not just trade in goods but exchange of ideas, movement of people, cultural interaction across large distances. Some researchers are now arguing that the Zimbabwe civilization should be understood as part of a broader pattern of African state formation in the second millennium CE. Around the same time Great Zimbabwe was rising, so were other major African civilizations. The Mali Empire in West Africa, reaching its peak under Mansa Musa in the 14th century. The Ethiopian Empire, with its rock-hewn churches and Christian traditions. The Swahili city-states along the East African coast. The Congo Kingdom in Central Africa. This was a period of African florescence, of urbanization, state building, economic growth, and cultural achievement across the continent. And yet, in popular consciousness, this remains largely unknown. People have heard of Timbuktu, maybe, but often as a joke, a byword for remoteness, not as the thriving center of learning it actually was. Most people have never heard of Great Zimbabwe at all. This has to change. The history curriculum has to change. The media representation has to change. The common knowledge has to change. And it is changing. Slowly. African historians, archaeologists, and activists have been fighting for decades to reclaim and publicize African history. African nations have invested in archaeological research and heritage preservation. International institutions are beginning to take African history more seriously. But there's still resistance. There are still people who, when confronted with evidence of African achievement, instinctively dismiss it, minimize it, or try to attribute it to outside influence. The racism that fueled the denial of Great Zimbabwe's African origins didn't disappear. It's more subtle now, more coded, but it's still there. You see it in comment sections when articles about African archaeology are published. You see it in the way museums curate their African collections, often still segregated in ethnographic sections, rather than integrated with art or history. You see it in the lack of funding for African archaeological research compared to other regions. You see it in the persistent stereotypes about Africa in movies, news coverage, and popular culture. Changing this requires sustained effort. It requires education. It requires representation. More African voices in archaeology, in museums, in media, in academia. It requires institutional change, rethinking how history is taught, how museums operate, how knowledge is produced and disseminated. And it requires sites like Great Zimbabwe to be properly funded, properly preserved, and properly promoted. Great Zimbabwe should be on every world history curriculum. It should be as famous as Machu Picchu. Tour groups should be flocking there. Documentaries should be made. Books should be written. This is starting to happen, but it needs to happen faster, more comprehensively. Because every year that Great Zimbabwe remains marginalized is another year that millions of people grow up with an incomplete, distorted understanding of human history. Let me paint you a picture of what proper recognition of Great Zimbabwe would look like. Imagine a child in Lagos or London or Los Angeles learning in school about the great medieval civilizations. They learn about the Mongol Empire, about the Song dynasty in China, about the Islamic Golden Age, about the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. And right alongside these, they learn about Great Zimbabwe. They see images of those massive stone walls. They learn about the trade networks reaching to China. They understand that while Europeans were building Notre Dame, Africans were building the Great Enclosure, that these are parallel developments, equally impressive, equally significant. Imagine that same child understanding that civilization isn't something that came from one place and spread everywhere. That humans in different parts of the world, given the right conditions, develop complex societies independently. That there's no hierarchy of races or regions, just different histories, different contexts, different achievements. Imagine the pride that African children would feel knowing their ancestors built this. Imagine the impact on their self-conception, their ambitions, their sense of what's possible. And imagine the impact on non-African children growing up with a more accurate, more complete understanding of history. Not learning racist myths, but learning the truth. That human achievement is universal, that every region has contributed to human civilization, that Africa's history is as rich and complex as anywhere else. This is what's at stake. This is why Great Zimbabwe matters, not just as a collection of ruins, but as a challenge to historical narratives that have done immense harm. So where do we go from here? What's the future of Great Zimbabwe? The physical site needs investment. Conservation work needs proper funding. The structures need stabilization. Vegetation management needs to be ongoing. Archaeological research should continue, using the latest technologies to extract maximum information while minimizing damage. The interpretation of the site needs to evolve. Visitor centers should tell the full story, the glory of the civilization, the complexity of its society, the injustice of colonial denial, the triumph of reclamation. Visitors should leave understanding not just what Great Zimbabwe was, but what it means. Tourism needs to grow, but sustainably. Great Zimbabwe can handle more visitors, and those visitors bring economic benefits to local communities. But this needs to be managed carefully. The site can't be loved to death. Infrastructure needs development, better roads, better facilities, but without compromising the site's integrity. Education is crucial. Great Zimbabwe should be taught in schools across Zimbabwe, of course, but also internationally. Textbooks need updating, curricula need revision, teachers need resources. The story of Great Zimbabwe should be part of the global conversation about human history. Digital access should expand. Virtual tours, online exhibitions, 3D models, all of these can bring Great Zimbabwe to people who can't physically visit. This democratizes access while also raising the site's profile. Research should continue. There's still so much we don't know. New excavations could reveal new information. Comparative studies with other sites could illuminate the broader Zimbabwe civilization. Interdisciplinary work combining archaeology, history, environmental science, and other fields could provide new insights. Community engagement needs to deepen. The Shona people's connection to Great Zimbabwe should be honored and strengthened. Traditional authorities should have meaningful input into site management. Local economic benefits from tourism should be ensured. Cultural practices at the site should be respected and facilitated. Repatriation should continue. Artifacts taken from Great Zimbabwe during the colonial era should be returned. Museums holding these objects should work with Zimbabwean institutions to repatriate them, or at minimum, to loan them for long-term display in Zimbabwe. These objects belong with the descendants of the people who made them. The international community has responsibilities too. UNESCO should provide more than just designation. It should provide resources. Foreign governments interested in cultural diplomacy should invest in Great Zimbabwe's preservation. Academic institutions should support training for Zimbabwean heritage professionals. The global heritage community should treat Great Zimbabwe with the same seriousness it treats other World Heritage Sites. And individuals have a role to play too. Learn about Great Zimbabwe, share what you learn, support organizations working on African heritage preservation. Visit if you can. Push for better education about African history. Challenge racist narratives when you encounter them. Because ultimately, preserving Great Zimbabwe isn't just about preserving stones. It's about preserving truth. It's about ensuring that future generations have access to accurate history. It's about honoring the achievements of the people who built this civilization. It's about challenging the racism that tried to erase it. Great Zimbabwe has survived 7 centuries. It survived abandonment, looting, denial, and reclamation. With proper care, with sustained effort, with genuine commitment, it can survive many more centuries. It can continue to stand as testament to African achievement, as challenge to racist myths, as inspiration to millions. The stones are still there. The walls still stand. The evidence still speaks. The question is, are we listening? We began this journey with a mystery, a lost city of gold, a civilization denied, a truth suppressed. We've traveled through 7 centuries of history. We've walked the stone passages of Great Zimbabwe. We've traced trade routes stretching thousands of miles. We've confronted the racism that tried to erase this achievement, and we've celebrated the reclamation of this heritage. But here's the final revelation, the thought that should leave you stunned. Great Zimbabwe isn't alone. It's one of dozens, perhaps hundreds of African sites whose stories have been suppressed, minimized, or ignored. The Zimbabwe civilization is one of many African civilizations that thrived, that achieved greatness, that contributed to human history. Across Africa, there are ruins waiting to be properly studied. There are histories waiting to be told. There are achievements waiting to be recognized. Great Zimbabwe is just the beginning. Every stone at Great Zimbabwe is a refutation of the lie that Africa has no history. Every wall is a challenge to racist narratives. Every artifact is evidence of sophistication, creativity, and achievement. The city might have been lost, but it's been found again. The truth might have been suppressed, but it's breaking free. And that truth is this: Africans built Great Zimbabwe. Africans created a civilization that rivaled any in the medieval world. Africans traded with China and India. Africans designed architectural marvels. Africans organized complex states. Africans achieved greatness. This isn't controversial. This isn't speculation. This is fact, supported by archaeology, by evidence, by truth. The stones of Great Zimbabwe have stood for 700 years. They've outlasted empires. They've survived colonialism. They've witnessed the reclamation of African dignity. And they'll stand for centuries more, silent witnesses to the lies we were told and the truth that cannot be suppressed. The lost city of gold was never really lost. It was just hidden by those who couldn't bear to see it. But we see it now, and we'll make sure the world sees it too. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, if it opened your eyes to a history you'd never heard before, then do 3 things. Hit that like button to help others find this story. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I want to know what surprised you most. And subscribe, because Great Zimbabwe is just one chapter in the untold story of Africa. There are dozens more civilizations, hundreds more heroes, thousands more achievements waiting to be brought to light. This is history they didn't teach you, but it's history you need to know. The stones remember, and now so will you.